Lockdowns, vaccines and peace in the Middle East. But to start our program this Reconciliation Week, here's singer-songwriter Mitch Tambo.
Yama yama. I'm Mitch Tambo, a proud Gamilaroi man, and it's an honour and a blessing to be here before you all tonight. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my utmost respect to the true owners and caretakers of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. For you are the first mothers, fathers, doctors, lawkeepers, agriculturalists, caretakers, and much, much more. For your law transcends the physical and shines throughout the Wadumbil, the Milky Way, flows through the Bugeye, the rivers and waterways, and Ulugis dances through the beautiful wind across this country. I'd like to acknowledge your elders, caretakers and youth, along with all elders, caretakers and youth across this nation. And may you be respected and uplifted always. And may the love of my family and people be with you all. So with that said, welcome to Q&A.
Hi there and welcome to the program. Joining me on the panel tonight, Mitch Tambo, who will perform for us a little later on. Author and academic Randa Abdel-Fattah. Liberal member for Wentworth and former ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma. International human rights lawyer Jennifer Robinson. And Labor member for Chifley, Ed Husic. Please make all of them feel welcome. Now, you can stream us live on iView and all the socials as always. Quanda is the hashtag. Please do keep it respectful. Our first question tonight comes from Catherine Lewis.
So, with the recent outbreak in Victoria, have we failed in our vaccine program, considering that we are still fighting spot outbreaks and contact tracing can really only work so far to stop the spread?
Ed Husic.
Where to start? Certainly not with the COVID Safe app. I'd have to say that complacency has been the big enemy here. Complacency by the federal government in securing the vaccine supplies required, complacency and responsibility shifting to the states on quarantine. Now, a few weeks ago, right in this chair, I think Dr. Norman Swan outlined how Pfizer approached the federal government in June last year saying, let's do a deal. There were initial discussions in July and nothing happened and the deal was not sorted until November. Now, we were told we'd be in the front of the queue. We were told we'd have 4 million people vaccinated by March. Then it became October. And now we don't know when it's actually going to happen because they're not going to commit to targets. The biggest thing we need people to be safe. We need people to feel secure. They're going to get that more if they know that the vaccines are available and are out there, and there's a sense of urgency to get this done.
Are you saying, though, the vaccine program has failed? That's the question.
Yeah, I think, well, by all accounts, I mean, most people would appreciate that because we haven't really vaccinated that many people, 1.7% in Australia. I hate to bring up the comparison because we do this so often. Kazakhstan, 5%. If you look in the States, 40%. And they had Donald Trump slowing that down and then they've obviously changed gear, shifted gear.
But reaching record numbers of daily doses now, I mean, we are... The rollout is ramping up very clearly, very obviously.
Well, I think, let me put it to you this way, Hamish. If you're in Victoria right now, you would have wished that this was going faster. And you would have also wished that we'd had a quarantine system that can cope with the emerging variants that are coming up now, where we've got aerosol-based. Instead of droplet, we've got aerosol, and the issue is hotel quarantine is not capable, is not meant to deal with this. So we do need to get a serious move on these two issues.
Mitch Tambo, you're from Melbourne. You got up in good time yesterday. How does it feel to have your home state going back into lockdown again?
Hamish, it's a real kick. You know, we really felt the brunt of it last year. We were in lockdown for, it felt like almost half the year. And I feel like for all of us in Victoria, you know, we feel like we've got our life back. You know, we're moving forward, work's busy, and then all of a sudden you wake up and again the calendar's empty and you don't know what's next, you know. But in saying that, I feel like we just have to do everything we can to maintain our health, look after community, and hopefully abide by the rules and get through winter, because I think that's the thing we're all concerned about is, winter's not even officially here yet, and here we are on the dawn of another, potential 3 or 4 months in lockdown.
Dave Sharma, if the vaccine rollout was on schedule as promised by your government, we wouldn't be in this situation, would we?
I don't agree there, Hamish. I mean, the vaccine provides protection against the disease, but so do a number of other measures we have in place. We've got the border restrictions, we've got hotel quarantine, we've got testing and contact tracing, and we've got physical distancing. And it's important to remember that we need multiple layers to protect ourselves from this disease. Now, on the vaccination program, the numbers yesterday were 3.9 million Australians who received their first vaccination. 105,000 Australians received a vaccination yesterday.
And that's an interesting statistic because actually that's close to 4 million, which your government promised to have delivered by the end of March. We're now towards the end of May. I mean, we are a really long way behind schedule.
Well, there's undoubtedly been slippage, but I mean, I'd point out the AstraZeneca vaccine, for instance. We contracted 3.8 million doses of those. We've only been able to get 700,000 of those. India has gone offline as a producer of vaccines and other materials because they've had their own pandemic to deal with. I don't think it's realistic to expect that there aren't going to be hiccups and obstacles along this pathway. But the point is that we adjust, we iterate, and we move on to the next phase. Now, where we are now, I mean, more doses are coming into Australia. We've got deals with Pfizer, with Moderna. We've got AstraZeneca coming online as well. I'm confident we'll get this done, but it is a reminder. I mean, look, in the United States, high vaccination rate, they had 25,000 new cases yesterday, 600 plus deaths. In the United Kingdom, 2,500 new cases yesterday. High levels of vaccination are important, but they're not a cure-all. We're going to need to keep a whole lot of other policy measures in place for some considerable time yet.
Jennifer Robinson?
I mean, border closures are not an answer and certainly not a long-term answer. The bungle that this has been is not only negligent, but it's going to cost Australian lives and has already cost Australian lives. And border closures aren't a long-term solution. We've got 36,000 Australians stranded overseas who aren't able to come home, which is unlawful. Human Rights Committee has already made provisional measures against Australia saying it's unlawful that Australians aren't able to come home. And that's because we don't have sufficient facilities. And nor does this government have a proper plan for that.
Dave?
I accept entirely that border closures have caused a significant degree of personal and other hardship to any number of people, including lots in my own electorate and, close personal friends of mine. But the truth is that Australia it's been one of a suite of measures that has meant that we've come through this pandemic on any objective measure a whole lot better than any other country in the world. I mean, we've had 910 deaths in Australia. About 800 of those were from the second wave in Victoria last year. Every one of those deaths is a tragedy and regrettable. But when you look at the numbers in the United States, over 600,000 deaths. In the United Kingdom, over 250,000 deaths. If we had anything like that here in Australia, we'd be talking about 20 to 30,000 of our fellow citizens who would have lost their lives.
Ed?
But this is the complacency that I'm speaking about. There's no sense of urgency. There's no, we don't have a mass information campaign urging people to go out and get the vaccination because our belief is that by the borders being closed, she'll be right. And this is not a good public health strategy. We need to have, we had a health minister that was saying you can get your vaccination now or you can wait till later. Wink, like waiting for someone else to, maybe another type of vaccination to come in because there's been hesitancy in terms of getting vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I just think, one, as I said, we need to have really a firm commitment out of the government to encourage people to get vaccine. We need to get quarantine sorted out. We need to get the vaccine production and manufacture here done. And the other thing is too, I genuinely worry, we're a relatively small nation. We've got the benefit of being an island continent and we're shutting ourselves off from the rest of the world as they're getting their act together. And we know the economic, but also what this does to us socially in terms of being closed off from the rest of the world. I don't think this is a good long-term prescription for the nation, and we do need to get our act together on this sooner rather than later.
Randa, according to the 7-day rolling average, which is about 73,000 doses currently, noting though that today we're well above that, it'd take something like 19 months more to roll this out across Australia. Do you see it as a failure?
Yeah, I do, and I think that, we pride ourselves and we like to co-opt the idea of being a multicultural society when it suits us politically. And then we forget the fact that there are so many Australians who have family overseas, who are connected with people overseas, who haven't seen their mothers, people who are having children here, who haven't, their grandparents haven't seen their children, who are desperate to be able to be reunited with their families. And that always gets missing from the debate, as though border closures are the answer, where it affects so many.
But there is broad support for the border closures, isn't there?
But when you speak to, of course there is broad support in terms of the short term, but it can't be a long-term solution here. It needs to be something that, like Ed said, there has to be a sense of urgency to these measures.
But the border closures, haven't they kept vulnerable Australian communities, remote Indigenous communities, safe throughout the course of this pandemic? You know, the predictions were that remote Indigenous communities could be wiped out if the pandemic reached there.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I'm talking about is when you have, for example, racially selective returns of citizens, Australian citizens. We have citizens in India who are not allowed to return, but we did not have the same sort of measures applied to citizens coming back from the UK and America. And to think that our communities aren't noticing those discrepancies and aren't seeing the racialisation of the way that these policies are impacting on multicultural communities, I think we need to think about and talk about that as well.
Dave Sharma, you do want borders open as soon as possible, don't you?
I do, but it's going to need to be in a way that's consistent with protecting the public health of Australians and consistent with the medical advice. I mean, what Ed didn't mention here is these policies have been agreed by the National Cabinet, state premiers, Labor and Liberal, and the Prime Minister on the basis of medical advice, the chief health officers and the chief medical officers of the states and territories. So, I mean, you know, if we got advice saying that it was safe to open the borders, of course I'd listen to the experts, but that is clearly not the advice right now. And I think most Australians...
But might that advice be different if a very significant proportion of the population was vaccinated?
Absolutely.
If 70 or 80% of the population
Absolutely.
was vaccinated, that advice would change.
Absolutely. And I don't think there's any intent on behalf of the government or certainly anyone in the parliament to keep borders closed for any longer than necessary. You know, there's a review that is underway.
Or maybe until after an election is held.
I don't think there's any linkage there at all. I mean, I don't think that our doctors or our chief medical officers give their advice depending on where we are in the political cycle. I think they're thorough professionals. And we'll take their advice. But obviously, high levels of vaccination will help us open the borders quicker. Diminishment of the disease overseas will help us open the borders quicker. And the risk profile of the country where we're hoping to open the borders with. I mean, we've got a travel bubble that's been open with New Zealand. It's now closed for Victorians and others. I'd hope we can start selectively opening some other ones. But again, it will have to depend very much on where the disease is at the time. And anyone who thinks the pathway out of this is linear just needs to look back and see how many setbacks we've had all along the way, not just in Australia, but worldwide. And I think it pays in those circumstances to, you know, not set in stone where you think you're going to be. Certainly always be hoping to open the borders quicker, but we need to be responsive and we need to adapt to what the conditions require.
OK, let's take our next question tonight. It comes from Suzanne Rutland.
My son lives in Israel and works with the International Committee of the Red Cross. When the Hamas missiles were being fired at Tel Aviv, he was messaging us that he and his wife were okay in their tiny, safe room. His dog was totally distressed. My son goes down regularly to the Sderot and the other places on the Gaza border for the Red Cross. Why is the suffering of innocent civilians being attacked, innocent Israeli civilians being attacked, and the Hamas being ignored?
Randa, Abdel-Fattah.
I'm so happy that your son has a safe house to go to. If only Gazans had the opportunity to escape the most densely populated place in the entire world. And it's been under a blockade by Israel for 14 years, cut off from the rest of Palestine. It got absolutely no freedom of movement. And so when you have a military power backed and funded by the US, $3.8 billion a year, you have the state-of-the-art advanced weapons dropping bombs on civilians, and you're talking to me about the safety of Israelis? Where are Palestinians in Gaza supposed to go to? Your son's puppy, your son's dog was scared. There are children who are massacred and slaughtered. 9 Palestinian families have been wiped off the civil registry. Just yesterday, there was a tweet about that. 9 Palestinian families no longer exist, obliterated. And you're talking to me about Israeli safety? Israel has state-of-the-art weapons defence system and missile defence system. Where do Palestinians go when they are being bombarded by the IDF, by one of the most powerful nuclear powers in the world? Where is their protection? Where are the people there to protect them from that onslaught? And Israel is targeting civilians. Yes, it is targeting civilians. Israel has access to, because it is the occupier, the population registry for Palestine. So it has the names, the ages, the residential addresses of every single Palestinian in Gaza, which is why it can make a phone call to say, we're going to bomb this residential tower at so-and-so time.
Randa, I'm just going to take us back to the question, though, which was about the role of Hamas and the impact on Israeli civilians. We've got a few questions on this. Dave Sharma, could I ask you for a response to that question?
Well, look, I mourn the loss of life on both sides of this conflict, innocent civilians on both sides of this conflict. Every loss of life is regrettable on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, and many people have suffered through this conflict. In my view, needlessly, this wasn't a conflict that needed to happen.
Why did it happen?
The proximate cause was that Hamas started to fire rockets at Israeli civilian populations. And that's really, there have been 5 conflicts. Since Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, there have been at least 5 conflicts between Hamas and Israel. And they've almost one started because an Israeli soldier was kidnapped and abducted, Gilad Shalit. Many others have started because of rocket fire from Hamas. I can't understand why Hamas does this, because it knows the response, as the response of any nation would be if its own population was taking rocket fire, would be to hit back at the sources of the rocket strikes. In Australia, if we were taking rocket fire here, I expect our population would be calling our political leadership and saying, what are you doing to stop this? It's that Israel has a right to self-defence. They don't choose to initiate a conflict with Hamas. They didn't initiate this conflict with Hamas. I think it's regrettable Hamas did so, but it's been to the detriment, certainly, of the Gazan civilian population, without doubt, and the Israeli population too.
When you say Israel has a right to self-defence, what you're actually asking us to embrace as a proposition is that an occupier and a coloniser, a state that is based on a racial apartheid system...
I don't accept any of those characterisations.
Well, the most prestigious human rights organisation, Human Rights Watch, found in its report last month that Israel is practising apartheid.
To be clear, they talked about a form of apartheid. I mean, they weren't calling it an apartheid state.
Hamish, if Palestinian intellectuals, activists, lawyers have for years been recording, and Israeli human rights organisations, that Israel is a settler apartheid state. It is an apartheid state that preferences one racial group over another. It is infused in every single aspect of its legal processes, its ethnic cleansing, its depopulation processes, its military occupation, its brutal military occupation in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Gaza, its brutal siege on Palestinians in Gaza. Even it affects Palestinians in the diaspora. My father is here today. He's older than the State of Israel. He was born in 1945. He has experienced 3 Nakbas, 1948, exiled in 1967, and today the ongoing Nakba. He cannot return to his house, which is still there, because he is a Palestinian. When we return as a Palestinian, we have to go there on our Australian passport, and we're at the mercy of a soldier, a conscript, who will decide whether we can enter. He gave us 3 days the last visit. Any Jewish person in this audience today automatically has a right to return and live in my father's birthplace. Don't tell me that's not apartheid.
Jen Robinson.
I have to agree with Randa. And it's one thing, Dave, to say that Israel has the ability to respond to rocket strikes, but in such a disproportionate and indiscriminate manner. If we look at the figures, just from the most recent conflict in the past month, something like 248 Palestinians have been killed, including 66 children. Israel has been indiscriminately targeting journalists, the bombing of media organisations. This is a deliberate attack on media freedom and also the ability of the world to understand what is happening on the ground. I've been working with the International Federation of Journalists working on the issue of the targeting of journalists, and there is case after case of people wearing clear press vests being sniped in the context of the Great March. Unbelievable targeting. It is not correct to say that Israel is right and is using the appropriate use of force in response to what Hamas has been doing. This is an unlawfully occupied people who have suffered great disadvantage, discrimination and human rights violations. There is a definition under international law of apartheid. Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, other Israeli human rights groups agree that it meets that definition. And it's time that the Australian government starts taking appropriate action. I am continually embarrassed by the conduct of the Australian government at the Human Rights Council, at the Security Council, voting against every single attempt for human rights accountability for what Israel and Hamas are doing. If the Australian government is so concerned about Hamas bombings, then why did we oppose the International Criminal Court having jurisdiction to look into the crimes of both sides of the conflict?
Let's let Dave respond to that.
I don't pretend the answers are easy here, but and I'm not here as the spokesperson for Israel, for that matter. I'm here as an Australian parliamentarian who's here as a representative of Australia. But having lived in the region, I can tell you that firstly, things are not as clear-cut as they might seem. Israel has not been in Gaza since 2005. They withdrew from Gaza. Shortly after Israel withdrew, Hamas took over Gaza. Hamas is committed to, in its own charter, to the destruction of the State of Israel and to imposing Islamic law upon what was historically the territory of Palestine. They're perfectly free to do that, but they're a listed terrorist organisation. Now, in my own experience, and this is certainly true of the Palestinian political leadership in the West Bank, Fattah, they would like to have a two-state solution. They support a negotiated two-state solution, but Hamas does not in Gaza. They've never accepted Israel's right to exist. They've never agreed to abide by previous peace agreements, such as the Oslo agreements, and they've never disavowed the use of terrorism as a tool. Now, and until such time as the Palestinian political leadership can be reunified in some way, or that Hamas agrees to a political settlement to this conflict, I think it's difficult for Israel to unilaterally solve this one. I mean,
it's not a conflict between Israel and Hamas. Hamas is not in the West Bank. Hamas is not part of the Palestinians who are living as second-class citizens in Israel. I mean, this is a constant. You've just basically ticked off every Hasbara argument of this Israeli lobby. The idea that, first of all, it's our fault that we are occupied. It's our fault that we haven't got a peace agreement. It's our fault. It's Hamas's fault that we are being bombed. Always putting the onus back on Palestinians when it is Israel who is the occupier. It is Israel who is instituting a brutal occupation in the West Bank, in Gaza, and don't tell me that Israel withdrew. Gaza has been under military siege for 14 years. Nobody can leave. There is no freedom of movement, of medicine, of goods.
I'd love to hear your solution. What's your solution?
I just actually want to broaden this conversation out to the rest of the panel. Mitch, I'm interested, without asking you to wade into the detail of all of this, how do you observe it? How do you watch a conflict like this unfold? We are talking about occupation, we are talking about people in the traditional lands, historic lands, religious beliefs and their connection with place. How do you view it?
Look, first and foremost, I'm not a political man, but, I'm a man, I think, that tries to operate through his heart and spirit. And, I feel like I don't know enough, but, where there's innocent lives being lost and talk of, it's not apartheid, it's just elements of apartheid. It's not cool, Obviously, I can relate on different multitudes because of historically what's happened here with our people and the ongoing genocide that is still current here today that we don't always like to hit front on and, say what it is, and over-representations. And I feel like it comes a time where us as human beings, we need to come together and look past religion and all of these things that we use to divide us and not use to actually come together and love and accept. Because at the end of the day, in, Palestine, young people are dying, I'm sure in Israel too, but it comes back to the occupier. And if it's really geared, is it colonisation? Are we trying to wipe out a culture here? That's not okay. And I mean, look at, 250 kilometres off the shore of Australia and you talk about West Papua, I bet 90% of people in here don't even know what is going on there. There's a media blackout there. There's 60,000 unaccounted lives since 2018. There's the largest gold mine on the planet, second largest rainforest. It's absolutely been raped of its resources. The Australian government has done heaps of stuff with the Indonesian military, and yet that military is doing things and committing acts of genocide. I mean, that's a shorter trip for those that don't understand. To get from the top of Australia to West Papua, it's shorter than Sydney to Canberra, and we don't know anything about it. So, I mean, there is things happening everywhere that's absolutely horrific, and it's all genocide, and it's all about control and occupation, and it's all about dominance. And there comes a time where we have to come together and say enough's enough, because, you know what, we are losing kids day after day. Here, every day we lose our kids. We've got some of the highest rates of suicide in the planet, over-incarceration, domestic violence, the list goes on, deaths in custody. And these things are happening over here in Palestine, West Papua, it goes on and on and on. And it comes a time where we have to put the guns down, so to speak, and just go, you know what, we have to come up with a solution here, because we can't let any more lives be lost. You know,
and what you said,
it's bloodshed.
Mitch, is connected. Everything that you just said now is connected by one thread, and that is settler colonialism. When you're talking about West Papua, when you're talking about Australia, when you're talking about Palestine. And Dave, you asked me what the solution is, and it's not this is not complicated. That is often used as an excuse, and it's used as an excuse to say it's too difficult, we're just going to accept the status quo, which is basically asking Palestinians to relinquish their basic human rights. It's asking Palestinians to embrace a status quo where they are second-class citizens, where they must accept being subjugated and oppressed and repressed and not being able to live with dignity the way we all expect that we are allowed to be able to live with dignity. So when you say what is the solution is impose sanctions on Israel, make injustice a bad investment, impose sanctions, impose an arms embargo, implement the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement.
But with a view to a two-state solution, is that your suggested model?
A two-state solution is something Israel doesn't even want. Through its illegal settlements...
I'm just trying to understand.
No, I don't, because it's impossible.
So what do you want?
I want one state where every human being is treated equally. And I want... That's what is so radical about that.
I don't think that the Palestinians want one state, and I don't think the Israelis want one state
well,
either.
Israelis, we know, don't, because the majority of Israelis and their governments
I would be hesitant to impose upon people something that they're not asking for themselves.
Israel is the occupier. Okay. Israel is in an illegal occupation. So before we even talk about what's going to happen once we're free, just set us free first.
We've got a lot of audience questions, so I want to take our next one. This question comes from Malcolm Burston.
This is directed to Mr. Husic. Hamas controls Gaza, and it was the likely winner of the recently cancelled elections, the elections that were cancelled by Mahmoud Abbas, who is Hamas's political opponent. Hamas is an acknowledged terrorist organisation which is committed to the destruction of Israel and either the removal or killing of all Jews from Israel. How then does the Australian Labor Party reconcile its recent policy of recognising a Palestinian state with the likely government being Hamas, with its supposed support of a two-state solution involving a Jewish Israel and an Islamic Palestine coexisting as peaceful neighbours?
So I think, if I can answer your question, the thing is we are going to have this cycle of violence repeat unless we get a durable solution, which is going to be, and Randa and I have different opinions on this, but certainly from my perspective, a two-state solution where Israeli families and Palestinian families can actually have a space to lead peaceful and happy lives.
Absolutely.
That is longer term is going to be necessary. The issue from my point of view is that I can't see, this is all lip service that is given to this. It's the easiest thing to say. I see it here and I see it overseas. I mean, Dave mentioned when asked in response to the question about how this all started, my understanding was that settler activists had, during the holy month of Ramadan, been requiring people to leave their homes. And you can appreciate how that would make people feel. I do not condone rockets being fired into Israelis, but at the same time, the response that we saw, I have to say, was disproportionate. You saw over 200 Palestinians killed, and the thing that got me was the nearly 70 children who lost their lives in that, and also the stories of families deciding to sleep as one in their basements, worried that that would be the last time they would be together. Now, I'm sure there are equally human stories as well on the Israeli side. The issue is we need to find a solution. And we are the only major political party that has said we will commit a future Labor government to, one, recognising the State of Palestine and working towards that. That needs to happen. Now,
And this question, though, was about how that would function if Hamas is the elected government of the Palestinians, given everything that's been said about Hamas.
Well, again, that's why we have said we want to be able to leave that to a future in terms of if we are elected, to be able to work out how to give effect to that and to take into account conditions on the ground. But we don't want to have a situation where we keep saying that we commit to it but do nothing concrete on it. And the other thing I don't want to see happen in domestic politics is to see, and we've seen this out of the coalition, where they have used a sensitive diplomatic situation for local political gain. I mean, we've seen recently the Prime Minister blatantly lie, saying that there was no bipartisan commitment to a two-state solution, suggesting that we'd moved away from it. Completely wrong. And he did a little tiny Trump during 2018 when he tried to say that we should recognise West Jerusalem as the capital. And I'm sorry, that happened during your first by-election.
Sure.
So
I can see you changing this to a discussion about the government, but it was a question about Labor's position.
It's actually, no.
So I just want to ask Jen Robinson for a response on this. Is there a particular problem if there is a Labor government and it recognises the state of Palestine, or Palestine as a state, and then Hamas is elected as that government, and then, for example, might say it continues to want to wipe out Israel, for example, or commit other acts that some countries consider to be terrorist acts. Does that pose a problem?
You mean act like Israel?
If the stated policy of the Australian government and the stated commitment internationally is to a two-state solution, then there are two states and we have to recognise there are two states. One is Israel, one is Palestine. We have to recognise both. Otherwise, we don't have a two-state solution. The rest of the question is about domestic politics and the domestic choices of the Palestinian people. And that's a separate question that can be dealt with down the line as part of peace negotiations ongoing. But if the solution is to be a two-state solution, then we must recognise Palestine. And the Australian government, the Liberal Party's position, is inconsistent with a genuine commitment to the two-state solution. But all of this comes down to self-determination. It is about self-determination and occupied peoples who have the right to self-determination. Whether we talk about the Palestinians or the West Papuans, we are giving a huge amount of press time and air coverage to what's happening in Gaza, and it's right and proper we do. It is a terrible conflict. But as Mitch points out, right here in Australia, the people of West Papua, just like the Palestinians, have the right to self-determination. There is a solution. They have the right to determine their own future. Indonesia is an unlawful occupier. There is an ongoing military operation right now, just as it was happening in Palestine, with a complete media blockout, and there is absolutely zero conversation in the Australian media about it. We need to start paying more attention to the unlawful occupation happening right on our doorstep.
Isn't part of the problem there that it's virtually impossible to actually get into West Papua, even without COVID?
That's right. Indonesia is refusing to allow international media, refusing to allow visits from the UN, despite Australia and more than half of the UN's member states calling upon Indonesia to allow access, because we need to see what's actually happening. We're getting reports of displacement of civilians, killing of children, disproportionate targeting of civilians, calling civilians, Indigenous West Papuans, terrorists and targeting them. It is an awful situation. And Australia needs to start playing a more prominent role. We have to stop providing military aid to Indonesia. We have to stop being complicit in these abuses.
Dave Sharma, is that a sensible suggestion?
Look, I think there's an understandable but I think unrealistic belief in Australia sometimes that if we ordain something, so it will be. That if we just do something, countries will react and they'll do what we ask them to do. I'd love to see a two-state solution, but I don't think Australia acting alone can bring it about. I would like to see the West
certainly Australia.
Could I finish? I'd like to see the West Papuans people's rights and autonomy respected, but whether we demand Indonesia do this, whether we threaten to cut off military ties or not, I don't think that would have any impact whatsoever.
But
so I'm interested in what can we practically do to
What can we practically do?
People.
We can actually stop voting against measures at the international community to support Palestine. Exactly. We can stop
I thought
Australia.
We were talking about West Papua here.
Well, we can also talk about that too. Australia can stop arming the Indonesian military and supporting the Indonesian state. Australia has an obligation under international law to not support and to take actions to give effect to people's right to self-determination. That requires standing up for the West Papuan people, and it requires standing up for the Palestinians.
And can I just say, I think we do underestimate the power of our voice as a nation. We have, at different points in time, been able to exercise our views where we believe that something different should happen, be it from championing against the continuation of apartheid in South Africa, through to even being able to manage a peace accord in Cambodia that was championed by Australia. I think where we believe that something is right and should be followed through, we should speak. And if I can come back to something that you wanted to cut the conversation off in terms of a domestic angle, it comes back to this point that if the coalition does not want to move beyond lip service on pressing for a two-state solution, then it won't happen. we will not see change. But we need like-minded countries to work together. That's the principle at an international level, that we get things done and we sort difficult issues out. It has to start somewhere, and the starting point is a belief in the power of our own voice on the international stage.
OK, let's take our next question. It comes from Mani Omaragic.
It is Reconciliation Week. Is Australia ready to hear its own truth? Are we brave enough to learn the atrocities that have happened in the past and the present? There's deaths in custody, children being removed. It's happening right now a faster rate today. The gap's not closing. So my question is, how will Australia find its heart?
Mitch.
Why'd you pick me, Haim? No, look, to be honest, great question. And I feel like I can only hope that, you know, we just get into schools. I feel like we have to educate the kids, you know, and educate the teachers. You know, I hear numerous stories from kids about the remarks from teachers in schools as well. So I think it's important that we educate teachers, we educate educators, and we get to the kids, because the reality is that's where we've got a greater scope to build capacity, build empathy, build a heart that's geared towards hearing our story, sitting with us and hearing our truths. You know, we can't turn our head away anymore to the truths of what happened here. And it's not to point fingers, and I don't come from that position, because I want to bring us all together so we can heal. I'm crying out for healing for my people, because we hear this term all the time, you're resilient, but that doesn't mean we want to be resilient. We want to be free. We want to be trauma-free. This transgenerational trauma stuff, it is scientifically proven that it can be passed on through the DNA. It is real. So to answer your question, I hope with all of my heart that we are coming to a position in this nation where we can stop turning our head away, open our hearts, and just grow a little bit of capacity for our story. Because the truth is the stolen generations, the majority of it, and when I say these words, it's not to trigger any of the old people that were taken, they weren't necessarily birthed out of love. Our women were raped and absolutely bastardised. And here we sit today with our women like 35 to 80 times more likely to be hospitalised due to domestic violence. That's our women. There's nothing more royal or sacred on this planet than our women. We are from the oldest living continual culture on the planet, and we are so overrepresented in this hell of domestic violence, and it starts as a root where we have to go to. And in order to face that root, we have to hit it front on and go, you know what, I didn't do it. But rather than turn away and go, that's not my fault, I'm not sorry, it's like a brother's, sister's, friend's, brother's, auntie's, uncle passed away and you heard about it and you go, you know what, are you okay? I'm really sorry that happened. I'm going to empathise with you. I'm going to open up my heart and give you a hug because I'm sorry. Let's talk about it. You know, our people are dying in jails, overrepresented in incarceration. We make up 3%. There was a statistic the other day that, you know, 41% of in-out-of-home care of our kids that are in foster care and whatnot are Aboriginal that make up that percentage. 41%. You know, it's growing. Our kids are still being taken away. We've got a new generation of stolen generations. You know, we're dying, we're killing ourselves. We're absolutely riddled in chronic disease and illness. You're going out into remote communities, there's inadequate human resources, the list goes on. And I'm not here to point and condemn and point out all these negativities, but I am here to cry out and say, please empathise with us. Please get on our story. Please listen to our story, because we need you. We need everyone. You know, and we all need to come together and love and accept one another, regardless of race, religion, gender, sexuality and class. Because you know what? Our young people need all of you, because our young people are killing themselves. Our young people are dying every day. Our women are getting bashed every day. And that's not me condemning my Aboriginal brothers, because our women are with all men from all walks of life, and it's not okay, and we have to put an end to it. Our people are dying of type 2 diabetes, and we sit and we talk about type 2 diabetes like it's a common cold. You know, our people out in remote communities are spending more time hooked up to dialysis than being out there in the bush and being connected and healing. So what we need is to grow capacity for our story. And there'll be people here tonight that will comment and they'll go, you're not really a black fella, look at you, look at your skin, what are you, 1% in your finger? It's not about that, it's about our spirit. It's about what's inside of our heart, our gi dui, our heart and our spirit. There's so many mob like me that are this colour because of our past, the stolen generations, and because of the obvious. Our parents get together and they marry from different nationalities because of this beautiful culture that we've got here. But what you can't take away is our spirit, the resilience of our ancestors. They're here. So to answer your question, we must come together. You know, we're in the final hour and we need each and every single one of you from every walk of life so we can journey together into a greater future.
Mitch, you're so powerful, you're setting off the alarm in the building. I think that means go on fire with that. Jen Robinson, that question was about whether Australia is ready to hear its truth. There are some difficult truths. Is Australia ready to hear them?
Look, 70% of Australians support the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I think it is about time that our country accepts this generous offer and invitation from Indigenous Australians. We can't have reconciliation without truth, and that's why the truth-telling process, which is part of the Uluru Statement that has been asked for by
You're talking about Makarrata, right?
Exactly, is such an important thing because so many Australians do not understand the extent of the injustices that were perpetrated against Indigenous Australians. And without properly understanding that, we can't understand the collective trauma and ongoing trauma that Indigenous Australians continue to suffer. But it's not just about truth-telling. We have to give Indigenous people a voice. The reason that we continue to have bad policy outcomes, deaths in custody, 475 since 1991, 6 in the past few months, more children than ever, double the number of Aboriginal children being taken from their families since the apology to the stolen generation. These outcomes have to change, and it's on us as white Australians to take this up, to hassle our elected representatives, to stand with 3% of our population are Indigenous peoples and help them achieve the justice that they deserve. It's about who we are as a nation and reflects how we put ourselves out to ourselves and to the rest of the world. We are one of the few liberal democracies in the world that properly recognises Indigenous people, and that has to change.
Dave Sharma, so much of the, I suppose, debate since the Uluru Statement has been about a third chamber, about constitutional recognition. But Makarrata and truth-telling is central to the Uluru Statement. What are your views? How should Australia do Makarrata? How should we hear these truths? What function does that play?
Well, I'd say, first of all, that this has to be a very high national priority. I mean, this leaves us incomplete as a nation. Our failure to properly reach a just and proper and equitable settlement with our Indigenous, the First Nations people here, our Indigenous Australians, the fact that they're not properly recognising the Constitution, and they should be as the First Nations peoples, the fact that they don't have a means directly of contributing on laws that are made about them. This is the only group of people in Australia about who we make laws for people of a particular race, but there's no mechanism to hear their voice, and this is what the voice co-design process is about. But also truth-telling and reconciliation, Makarrata, the other key element of the Uluru Statement. Look, we are going through the co-design process now for the voice, and I want to see that moved ahead and advanced. Truth-telling, I'm in the hands of people like Mitch and others to tell us how do we take this to the next stage. What does it involve? What is needed from us as the government? What's needed from us as a people? But I'm all ears because this is a blemish on the Australian soul, and it's something we need to fix.
It is a vexed political issue, though, Ed Husic. Do you think our politicians are ready to hear these truths?
I think they need to undertake that process themselves individually, and I'll explain why. I represent in Chifley, which sits in Darragland, one of the largest urban-based Aboriginal communities in the country. And obviously through my role as an MP, I get to hear firsthand from Aboriginal people from all over the place what's happened. But the thing that really accelerated my understanding was reading Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu. And when you go through, and the reason I mention this is when you go through and you see the systems that were in place in terms of how people lived their lives here before colonisation, you know, this realisation had dawned on me. I was sorry not just for the injustice, but I was sorry that I never took the time to learn, that I never understood what was going on. We never learnt this at school, right? And then you start to think, you're stopped from speaking your languages, celebrating your culture, being with your people, your children separated, And truth-telling is important because everything else that we want to be able to do has to come from a point of understanding why. And the project that existed in this country for so long was about making Aboriginal people in this country forget who they were. That truth is very hard to hear, but you have to if you want to do all the other things. And Mitch, when you say, as you said a few moments ago, to understand, a lot of the people in our area, they're not after guilt. They don't want to make people feel guilty. They want us to do what we would do if something had happened to us that fundamentally, which is just appreciate what I went through and then we can talk. And that's why this is important. And that's what we've got to do.
Randa, Abdel-Fattah, to go back to the question, is Australia ready to hear these truths? What do you think?
I think there's a lot of... Well, I have to first foreground that I'm speaking as a settler migrant, the daughter of settler migrants, and I understand what it means to be dispossessed of your land. And I think that we need, as a community, to speak less about people's feelings and how that I'm not going to point the finger at somebody or guilt, and actually address the issue of Indigenous sovereignty here, because we do our acknowledgements of country and we stand up and we speak about, you know, having respect for Indigenous culture, and we still have apocalyptic fits in this country about changing Australia Day or abolishing Australia Day. We still cannot understand. We're talking about truth-telling and we still celebrate Invasion Day in this country, and we dismiss Indigenous people's, you know, cries about the fact that you are celebrating a day that represents the loss of their land, that represents the invasion of their lands, the genocide of their people. So, I mean, I think it's very self-indulgent for politicians to talk about, you know, respecting Indigenous stories, and we still can't commit to action. We can talk about, you know, truth-telling, but we still haven't implemented reports about deaths in custody, about Indigenous children being taken from their homes. And I also think that it's not in my place to talk about this. I feel deeply uncomfortable even commenting here. As a settler migrant, all I want to do is listen to Indigenous people and let them lead the discussion, let them lead the solutions. They're not homogenous, so not everybody accepts the idea of treaty, not everybody accepts the idea of constitutional recognition, and that's why I feel deeply conflicted even offering an opinion about this. I think it's something that Indigenous people need to lead the conversation, and we need to go and listen to them and take their cues about what needs to be done.
Is there... To that point, though, Mitch, briefly, is there a need, though, for non-Indigenous Australians to actually take a position on this and start to say, I believe these things are important?
100%. But I feel like in taking that position, you're putting down a textbook and you're going into your local community to sit with our people, to form a relationship, to have a cup of tea, to hear our stories, and to feel. You know, and you will feel a lot of love, a lot of joy, a lot of happiness, but you will also feel the raw effects of transgenerational trauma and the stolen generation. And I mean, we get that a lot, you know, get over it, it happened. But the reality is, a sister, Nerida Jacobs on Studio 10, she posted the other day and her dad was taken. So there you have it, a sister that's in front of you every day, and that's her father right there. It's not, you know, there's a lot of us, even from my generation, when our parents were born, they were considered flora and fauna. And there's also a lot of us today that haven't had kids yet. So it's like not getting over it, it's preparing for what's ahead, because there's babies that are about to be born and it was their grandmother or grandfather that were considered animals and plants, and they're about to feel that pain. So we haven't even gotten to that stage yet. But I feel like we need allies. We need people that have the capacity to empathise and get passionate, because we need forward thinkers, you know, people that are going to get in there and shake it up for us. You know, we make up 3% of the population. We need, you know, another like 47% to even nearly get halfway in people being with us, you know. So we need as many people as we can get. And I just urge and encourage everyone to immerse yourself in your local community. Get familiar, know the aunties, the uncles, the elders. You know, learn a bit about the local language and let that snowball. And as you get educated, you'll grow and grow this capacity for us, because we need everyone on board this journey so we can make change.
All right, let's take our next question. We'll wait for the applause. Our next question comes from Joshua DeBoos.
Yes, a lot has been read into the Upper Hunter by-election loss, with Anthony Albanese struggling to land blows against repeated Morrison mistakes. Does the Labor Party need to consider a change of approach or a change of leadership?
A change of leader, Ed Husic.
Geez, that question certainly morphed very dramatically. OK, so, you know, there's been a lot of focus on one state by-election result in a seat where we haven't held that seat for 90 years, and we're not talking about the implications of the West Australian or the Queensland election results on Labor's federal fortunes either. And in both cases, I see the differences. These are state jurisdictions where issues play out differently.
But the federal Labor MPs from that part of New South Wales do seem to say that this is a problem for Labor.
Well, we're a very big family and we have very wide and different views, as I'm sure Dave could testify within his own family in terms of the coalition. And so, yeah, absolutely, local MPs will have and should, like Joel and Merrill, be able to express their views. But I think if you look at it, our job at a federal level is to get, in terms of the policies that we think will strengthen with respect to jobs and the health of the nation, we've got to get focused on that. And I think a lot of stock is put on, as I said, in terms of the Upper Hunter by-election, where if you look in particular with the results, if we are going to focus on the results there, the Nationals have had, what, a slip of, in 10 years, 20% shaved off their primary vote, and we're not having existential-like questions being posed to them, but I'd be concerned about a 20% drop in a primary in that one area. So I think for us, the focus is to make sure that we have got a strong alternative to the government and taking up those issues here and elsewhere.
Jen Robinson, when you look at Anthony Albanese, do you think that's a leader that's really on the way up, or does he look like he's struggling to you?
I think he's doing a great job. I think Albo is authentic and really cares about the Australian people and remembers where he comes from. And I think the progressive policies that we're seeing from the Labor Party are policies that many Australians want to see in government. So,
why is there so little support for him then as alternative Prime Minister?
I don't think that's necessarily what the polls are saying. I haven't seen the most recent one, but I thought Labor was up.
But his personal approval ratings compared with Scott Morrison's are pretty diabolical.
Well, can't always go in the polls.
Yeah.
Dave Sharma, do you think...
And by the way, if we listen to the polls, I wouldn't be here as a shadow minister.
Is it unreasonable to read into this particular by-election? I mean, it is clear that Labor is struggling in certain marginal seats across the country.
I'm reluctant to be a commentator at the best of times as a politician. I'm certainly not going to commentate on another party's fortunes or prospects, so I'll leave these answers to Ed and Jen.
Well, let's take our next question tonight. It comes from Connor McLeod.
Okay. Firstly, I'd like to share that I'm a proud Gadigal man, and I really appreciated your acknowledgement, Mitch. Thank you for that. My question's actually for you. Do you believe First Nations artists have a unique set of responsibilities to their communities, such as activism, storytelling, incorporating traditional instrumentation as you do, and language? If so, is that fair?
Before we go to him, do you think it's fair?
I'd like to hear Mitch's take.
Come on.
That's right, he's asking the questions.
You've clearly got a position. What do you think before we go to Mitch?
I think either way, you'll have a lot of young artists watching this, and I think either way you float on this, Mitch, there'll be benefit to it. Personally, I don't think it's fair. And personally, as an artist myself, I don't think it's fair to impose a responsibility on a creative. I believe creativity is an expression of freedom, like you were saying before, and the state that's imposed on Indigenous people that requires prominent Indigenous people to act as activists shouldn't necessarily be my responsibility, although personally I like to, but you know, that's not the responsibility of an up-and-coming 16-year-old that likes indie rock, you know what I'm saying? Like.
OK, Mitch, your turn.
Well, firstly, Bill, it's beautiful to be here in your country, so yeah, thanks very much. And you know, all my love and respect to you and your people. I love what you say because I feel like, you know, just because you're a black fella doesn't mean you have to be boxed in, you know? You don't just have to wear red, black and yellow, you know what I mean? We're connected to all multitudes of colours, you know? So in terms of artistry, I feel like there's thousands of different ways to tell your story, honour and celebrate your people, and that might not involve some clapsticks, boomerangs, language, you know? As for me, I do that because I connect with that. I feel like that's who I am. That's what I've been called to be. So I feel like you know, for young artists like yourself and artists in general, it's all about expressing yourself and doing what you feel because, you know, I believe our ancestors guide us, and whatever that fire is in your spirit, then you have to follow that and express yourself in the way in which you feel and, you know, honour your people and honour your story. And like you said, just because you're an Aboriginal person doesn't mean you have to be an activist. You don't have to be. You know, it's like me. I started by saying I'm not a politician because I have an opinion and I have a belief and it's my perspective, but by no means do I want to be looked at as political. And often or not, we can be put in that box. And I think it's a valid question, and I feel like you've just got to express yourself, have fun with it. And, you know, wherever you're doing the right thing, your ancestors are shining down on you and they're proud. You know, you're here, you represent them, and it's a beautiful thing.
Mitch, you've done a lot of incredible things in your career. A lot of people love your music, but it strikes me that one thing you did in particular kind of took everybody's attention, and that was performing John Farnham in language. Why does that carry so much power? Why do you think it had impact?
Well, first and foremost, it's like the unsung anthem, everyone says, so it was very daunting when I did it. I was kind of like in a world of regret at one point.
Yeah,
but, you know, I feel like my version of the story is that when Uncle John put it out there was to stand up and be a voice for domestic violence, that we've got to stop, and we have to be that voice for change. And when I took the song on, I thought, you know, I really resonate with that and I want to extend that message. You know, we have to uplift and honour our women, but we also need to come together and look past race, religion, gender, sexuality and class and actually love one another, you know, so that we can build a platform for the next generations to walk upon where they can be truly who they feel they're meant to be. You know, if you want to rap and you're Islamic and you're Muslim, that you can walk down the street and rock your burqa and not have to worry. You know, that if you're a proud black fella and you want to rock your lap, don't be shame. Go and rock it down the street after you perform, you know. If you're, you know, from the LGBTQI+ community, you don't have to live in fear and be scared and come out when you're 35 and not at 15. Be free to be who you want to be. So I decided that I would take on the song and make it authentic to me and you know, honour my path and my ancestors and do it in my language with that story. So, good. Yeah.
Did he change your mind, Connor?
No, I think we agree.
Okay. What a great way to end the night. That's almost all we've got time for tonight. Some live music from Mitch for you in a moment. But first, would you please thank our wonderful panel, Mitch Tambo, Randa Abdel-Fattah, Dave Sharma, Jennifer Robinson and Ed Husic.